is Lauren Schaller, and I am presenting to you, educators, a little bit of information about project-based learning. So this is project-based learning, and then it will be a little bit of a focus on mathematics teaching. And this video is going to be very, very long, so I can tell you right now that there is definitely going to be a part 2. So this is part 1 of 2. So what exactly is project-based learning? I took one definition that's available from the Buck Institute for Education website, and that is PBL is a teaching method in which students learn by actively engaging in real-world and personally meaningful projects. So one distinction that I'm going to make for sure is that it's not a class that has a project in it. It is a class where the learning is delivered entirely through the project. And there's a picture of me in the corner. So what does this really look like? Well, a lot of information has been presented and everybody seems to have a different idea. But a lot of people don't really agree, although I will be giving you some information, examples. Some say, well, hey, maybe because this is a student-centered, student-generated type of teaching and learning, that maybe it's best that there is no agreed upon, solid definition, really. And some say that project-based learning isn't really to be differentiated from other types of learning at all, that they really are all the same thing. But we can make something pretty clear here. There is a dessert project where a lesson might be taught, and then it culminates in a project at the end of the unit. So it's kind of almost like the assessment at the end. It's very teacher-directed. It's product-focused, end result, performance-focused normally. It might not be related to learning other things. It's learning the one thing that, or a few things that were content taught in the unit. But then in project-based learning, all of the learning is delivered through the project. The project is the unit in of itself. So the project's really introduced at the beginning. There's the whole thing's a project, and it's really that the content learning is all going into what do I need to do to complete this project. So it's much more student-driven. It is very inquiry-based, tends to do all those wonderful things that we have learned about in our Reading with the Joe Boller book. So the Buck Institute is considered one of the best resources for PBL, and they have this thing called Gold Standard PBL. So if you really want to have, be the shining knight example of PBL, then these are some things you might want to do. So let's dig in a little bit to what they consider to be the essential elements. I know this is a little confusing at first, but it will make sense in a second. So in PBL, you start with a driving question. Well, not true. You start with an event that jumpstarts the thinking of the students, and then you come up with this driving question that drives everything in the unit. So this really made me think of chapters 3 and 5 of the Boller book with that Wolfram model, and it all starts with the question. And then there are other instances in the book, and I'm indicating them to you by moving my mouse around here. In all those times where we had to think about all these different ways of teaching, could you ask the problem before you're actually teaching it? Then throughout the unit, you're going to move on to the second part, sustained inquiry. Can you make learning inquiry tasks? Can you take a task and make it inquiry-based? And then make it authentic, all about real world, real things that students are going to encounter. And that hits a lot of what we've learned so far in this class for sure. The Wolfram model is just one example, but there are lots of times where we are encouraged to use real world information and artifacts and people, all sorts of things. Student choice is important. We want to give them choices as best as we can. This was a main section in a most recent reading in Chapter 7, and students should be asking the questions. Then students should reflect and critique and revise. They should get that chance to embrace their mistakes. This is what we did wrong, and these are all the different ways of doing the same thing. And then in Chapter 8, there is an emphasis on allowing students to be able to submit their work to get a higher grade. Give them the chance. Use the assessment as a learning opportunity. And then last but not least, this is considered a pretty important part of the process by the Buck Institute for PBL because students are going to create something that's not meant for the classroom. It's meant to be given to, I don't know, a government official or a project that's meant to be delivered to an actual client. Something that gives it, whatever the students are doing, a real gravity, very, very authentic, which really drives their motivation because it's not just something for the classroom. So I have a side-by-side comparison of doing the project, the dessert, where the project's here at the end. So if you look at the timeline here, this might be a typical unit. Lecture at the beginning, some practice problems. We have teacher lecturing, working out of the textbook. Practice problems might have a discussion here, and then the project. Let's line up a PBL example. So here's this entry document. This is the spark of inspiration. It could be a document, it could be a video, it could be anything. And then the students develop this driving question at the start of the unit, and that's the key, this driving question. And everything that they learn in this unit, this project, is driven by this question that hopefully, maybe not, they came up with, which gets them intrigued. It maintains their interest throughout the unit. Everything the students do fall back to this driving question. It feeds this question. So they're doing investigations, practice problems, maybe they'll have a quiz, textbook activity, discussion, research, practice problem. There's a lot of things that are the same. And then at the end, they have this rubric. Theoretically, you might give your students your rubric a little earlier. It might not come at the end, but you still have a way to evaluate what they have learned, what they've put into their learning. So again, the driving question. The students in a PBL unit should be revisiting the driving question every day. Everything they're learning is going into that inquiry, that question that they've asked. Then they generate this need-to-know list. So at the beginning, they say, okay, I have this question. What do I need to, what information do I need to learn in order to answer that question? They are driving their own learning. So what do you think? What do you think a good example of a driving question would be? Feel free to pause the video. So here are some of my thoughts, something I came up with that I thought would be appropriate examples. Maybe, how can I clean up the water pollution in a nearby lake? Why does my car need to pass an emissions inspection every year? So again, we're still talking about what project-based learning even is. So all these things we've been learning about, critical thinking, students are driven and teachers are facilitators. Inquiry is a big part of it as well. Now, I know this statement looks a little weird here. Not everybody agrees on how to implement project-based learning. So there's still a lot of questions up in the air. In fact, I have a huge list of questions I'm going to let you see. Now, at least when I first learned about this, I kept thinking, okay, what's the difference between project-based learning and problem-based learning? So we have two PBLs. Both do a lot of wonderful things, or can do a lot of wonderful things, open-ended, they're authentic, 21st century skills, student-driven, it's their inquiry that's driving everything. They tend to be a little more in-depth. However, project-based learning is considered a little more open-ended, a little more interdisciplinary, a little longer. The problem-based learning is a little more focused, shorter. It's just a little tighter of a unit, you might consider. In my research, I found that math teachers tend to use problem-based learning more because it seems to be easier for them to focus on short, quick, learn this concept and move on. Some of them do anyway. I, FYI, am not a math teacher by trade. I am a secondary science teacher. So, project-based learning can be great, but there's still so much that we don't know at all about it. So one of my best resources was a literature review, and investigating a lot of research and studies on project-based learning, and there is still so much to learn. So these are some of the questions that are still up in the air about project-based learning, PBL. And some of these we already went over. Can it be defined? Should it be defined? How long should a project-based learning unit take? Is it something that should be a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months? Maybe it depends on the age. How much student choice should take place? Should it be like a 50-50, a 75-25%? How much should the students be collaborating? Should they just have kind of at least a moment to collaborate, or should like almost the whole thing be collaboration? How can you assess project-based learning? This is a big bone of contention in education right now, I know in general. This great type of learning that we want, not the parrot back learning, but in-depth detail, like you really learned in a multifaceted way. How do you assess that? What is more effective? PBL that teachers generate, or that teachers get that somebody else generated, or if project-based learning is a school-wide initiative? So how do you create a coherent unit? Coherent means everything weaves together. There's a streamline in the information. The information comes together, is themed, there's a concept, it makes sense. Why are we learning this? What does it have to do with the main question? This can be kind of challenging. What is the best classroom management? As you can guess, project-based learning can get messy, as well it should. And how do you manage that type of a classroom if you're not used to it, or if your students aren't used to it? Not all teachers are comfortable transitioning from being the one leading the way to I'm just going to sit back and make sure that my students understand and I guide them gently. How do you scaffold learning and then cut back on that? How can practice be used to benefit PBL research so that more people benefit from it and see that it can be good or bad, or maybe both depending on the situation? How do we use technology to boost PBL effectiveness? How can we use PBL in math classes more effectively? How can PBL be effective for students with disabilities, English language learners, low-income students, other types of students? Is PBL really effective in general? So does it really work? A lot of studies have shown positive results, but not enough to be conclusive. And this working paper I've used as a resource was very critical of this. A lot of studies use so many variables that it's not clear that, the great success that the students had, it might not have been because of project-based learning. It might have been for some other reason. Or maybe the exact details of how project-based learning was done was not revealed. For example, I think this was a pretty good example, especially because it came from our author, although it's kind of an old study. Joe Boller in 1997 showed some really nice positive results using project-based learning, but some other aspects of the study were involved. The participants were not selected randomly, and the teachers were selected only due to their greater experience and skills than the other group that was part of the study. So it's not really clear exactly why the students had more positive results. Many of the studies that were looked at lacked validity and reliability. And the subject areas that lacked the most PBL studies and research were math and English. Lots of good responses for science and social studies, but math is greatly lacking. So, and I love this quote here, PBL is unusually challenging to implement. So, many studies out there will say, more research needs to be done for anything to be conclusive. More research needs to be done. You hear that a lot. But this statement really brings out that PBL is really challenging. So there's a lot of reasons why PBL can be challenging, more challenging for teachers in particular, and also math teachers. Teacher training is limited. In order for students to effectively teach PBL, they need to really believe it works. The belief is what powers it, really. So if that belief is built up by the kind of teaching that's more firsthand experience, and a lot of teacher training doesn't have that, so that's not there to fuel that. And teacher belief and what teachers are thinking in their minds as they're teaching, it is a big part of the success. If teachers have low expectations, or if they think it's going to be too hard, it's not going to be successful. And here again, it needs to be coherent. So everything needs to be woven together.